The millionaire always believed his fortune was a shield against lies, but it was the gardener, a simple and sincere woman, who revealed the betrayal he feared. When confronting the truth, he discovered something that no amount of money could buy. Richard stood outside in the garden behind his large house. From where he stood, he could see Elizabeth through a window on the second floor. She did not look out at him. She did not wave or smile. She seemed distracted. He moved closer to a row of trimmed bushes, keeping his eyes on her. He noticed how she held her phone in her hand and kept glancing at it. There was a strange tension in her shoulders. The gardeners always kept the place neat. The shrubs formed perfect lines. The flowers were clean and bright. The air here smelled fresh and mild. Grace appeared at his side without warning. He had not heard her approach. She said, "Richard, I know I shouldn't say this, but I think Elizabeth is seeing someone else." He turned his head sharply toward Grace. "What are you talking about?" His voice came out low and tight. He rarely spoke to the staff about personal matters. He felt a dull tension in his chest as he faced her. He noticed the way her eyes did not flinch. Grace shrugged lightly. "I hear things. I see her meeting a man near the side entrance. I see how she acts when you're not around." She paused. "I'm sorry." Richard frowned. He felt a rush of heat in his face. He studied Grace's expression. She was not smiling or joking. She looked tired. There was a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead. Her posture was steady. Richard glanced away from Grace, looking again at Elizabeth's shape behind the glass. He tried to steady his breath and remain calm. He said, "You realize these are serious accusations?" Grace nodded. "Yes, I know. I would not say it if I wasn't sure." Richard narrowed his eyes. He pressed his lips together and tasted the bitter smoke on his tongue. He felt a sense of tightness in the back of his neck. "You have any proof?" Grace shook her head. "I only know what I see. She is not loyal." "You deserve to know." Then Grace stepped back. She touched her chin and shifted the trowel from one hand to the other. She lowered her gaze to the ground. She spoke softly. "I'm sorry. This is not easy for me to say." Richard remained quiet. He felt a dull ache in his stomach. He looked at the flower beds. They smelled sweet, a strong and clean scent. It clashed with the taste of the cigar, which felt rough and unpleasant now. He wanted to spit, but he did not. He stood there, weighing Grace's words. He thought of the many times he had doubted Elizabeth's affection. He remembered her cool tone at dinner. He remembered how she often looked away when he tried to hold her gaze. He turned back to Grace. "Why would you tell me this?" he asked. His voice was lower, almost a whisper. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. "Because I see you standing here alone," she said. "You're a decent man. From what I can tell, you should know the truth." Richard nodded slowly. He did not know what to believe. Part of him wanted to dismiss this. Part of him suspected it was true. He felt an unpleasant heat spreading through his body. He gritted his teeth and flicked ash off the cigar, watching the gray dust fall onto the grass. He said, "I'll handle this." Grace said nothing. She returned to her work, kneeling near a bed of flowers, pushing the trowel into the soil. She did not watch him leave. Richard stood there a bit longer, then walked around to a side door and entered the house. He moved quietly through the halls. The interior smelled of polished wood and floor cleaner. He could hear the distant hum of the air conditioning. He listened for Elizabeth's footsteps or her voice, but heard nothing. His polished shoes tapped lightly on the tile. He passed the large living room with its leather couches, the silent dining room, and a long corridor leading to his study. He paused by the stairs. Tomorrow was the anniversary of their wedding. He had planned a formal dinner with a small group of friends. James Hudson, a trusted friend, was supposed to attend. The thought of this event now made him feel trapped. He clenched his jaw. He wanted to know if Grace was right. He wanted to see Elizabeth's reaction to a direct hint. He wanted to see if she would crack under pressure or remain calm. He felt his heart beating faster. He climbed the stairs and turned left toward the bedroom. The hallway was quiet. He opened the door to the master bedroom and found it empty. He checked the bathroom and closet. No one was there. He frowned and left, heading toward a small lounge room. He found Elizabeth there, sitting on a velvet chair, flipping through a magazine. She looked up, startled. "Richard, I didn't hear you come in," she said. Her tone was light, but her eyes moved quickly over his face. She seemed to notice his tension. He cleared his throat. "I was outside. I spoke with Grace. She mentioned something strange." He paused, watching her. "There are rumors going around. Something about you and another man." Elizabeth's posture changed. Her hand froze on a page of the magazine. She blinked rapidly. "What?" She forced a small laugh. "That's ridiculous. Who would say such a thing?" Richard stepped closer. He tried to appear calm, but inside he felt a twisting sensation. "Grace said it," he said. "She claims she saw something. I want to know if there's any truth to it." Elizabeth shook her head. "Grace must be mistaken. She's just the gardener. She doesn't know what she's talking about." Her voice sounded tense. She looked away and focused on a spot on the carpet. Richard watched her closely. He noticed a slight tremor in her hand. She turned a page of the magazine even though she wasn't reading it. He could hear her breathing a bit faster. He decided not to press further right now. He wanted to see how she behaved at dinner. He would prepare subtle hints and watch her reaction. There was a formal dinner planned for this evening, just the two of them, as usual. He said, "I see." He turned and left the room without another word. As he walked toward the dining area, he thought about what he would say. He would not accuse her directly again tonight. He would just suggest certain things and observe her response. He wanted her to slip, to reveal something. He wanted her to confirm his worst suspicions so he could stop doubting and finally know what was real. Before going downstairs, he stopped by the balcony at the end of the hall. He looked down at the garden. It was growing darker now. He saw Grace's figure bent over a row of flowers, her back to him. She moved slowly and methodically, focusing on her task. He wondered why she had spoken to him. He felt uneasy about trusting a stranger's word, but her calm honesty had left a mark on him. He turned away from the balcony and went down to the dining room. The table was set with crystal glasses and polished silver. A single candle burned at the center. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the chair at the head of the table, waiting for Elizabeth. He listened to the silence of the house. It felt heavy. He took a long breath and sat down. His shoulders felt stiff. He rolled them once, trying to relax. He would ask a few questions tonight. He would watch her eyes. He would confirm or deny the truth of Grace's warning. He took a sip of water and set the glass down. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. He heard light footsteps approaching. Elizabeth stepped into the room, her face composed. He offered a small nod. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Let's have dinner," he said. I want to talk." Richard sat at the dining table, his back straight, hands resting on the arms of the chair. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Elizabeth entered a moment later and took her seat across from him. A servant brought out 2 plates of grilled fish and steamed vegetable. The aroma was fresh, but somehow unappealing to him now. He picked up his fork. Elizabeth adjusted her napkin on her lap and lifted her glass of water. Her eyes did not meet his. He tapped the tines of the fork against the plate's edge and cleared his throat. "I spoke with Grace today," Richard said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "She mentioned something unusual. It seemed important to her." Elizabeth cut a small piece of fish. Her hand trembled slightly. "Grace," she said, sounding mildly annoyed, "why are you discussing personal matters with the gardener?" She looked up, her eyes narrow and tense. Richard shrugged, careful not to show too much emotion. "She approached me. She seemed concerned." He took a small bite and chewed slowly. The fish tasted bland. "She claimed you might be involved in something. Someone else. To be more exact." Elizabeth pursed her lips. She lowered her fork and stared at him. "You mean she's spreading gossip about me?" Her voice was quiet but firm. "Grace should mind her own business." Richard leaned back in his chair. "You sound defensive." "Why is that?" He watched her eyes. He noticed the way she fiddled with her glass. He listened to the slight catch in her breath. Elizabeth set down her utensils. "Because this is ridiculous. You're going to trust some gardener over me? A woman who's worked here for what? A few months?" She scoffed. "This is beneath us. I won't even dignify it." He nodded, pretending to accept her words. Inside, he felt tense. He noticed how her voice had grown sharper. He pressed on, softly. "Beneath us? Yes. Still. It concerns me. I think about tomorrow's anniversary. Our guests expect a pleasant evening. I don't want any rumors causing trouble." She picked up her fork again and poked at the vegetables. She did not eat. "We should focus on the anniversary, not the words of a gardener. Everyone we know respects us. They know we're happy." She paused, looked down at her plate. "You know how people can be. They talk." Richard reached for the salt and sprinkled a tiny amount on his fish. "That's what bothers me. People talk. We live in this large house. We have staff. We have privileges. But maybe we don't know what goes on behind our backs." He studied her expression. "It might help if you gave me some reassurance. Something concrete." Elizabeth let out a short, forced laugh. "What kind of reassurance do you want?" "A love letter." She shook her head. "Richard, if you can't trust me, we have a bigger problem than just gossip." He took another bite and swallowed. "Yes, we might." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I want to trust you. I do. But something feels off. Maybe it's just the stress of tomorrow's event. Maybe it's my own insecurities. But I saw how you reacted when I brought up the rumor." She sighed, looking irritated. "How did I react?" He tilted his head slightly. "You seem nervous. You're pushing this aside too quickly. Instead of calmly denying it, you attack Grace's credibility. It's interesting." Elizabeth gripped the edge of the table. "Richard, I'm insulted. I'm your wife. We've been married for years. You have a lot of nerve to accuse me based on nothing." He spread his hands, palms up. "I'm not accusing. I'm asking. I want you to assure me. Tell me you love me. Tell me there's no one else. That's all." Elizabeth opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. She took a breath and said, "I love you." Her tone sounded flat. "There is no one else. I'm tired of this conversation." She stood up abruptly. "I don't want to deal with this right now. I'm going to bed." She left her plate barely touched. She walked out, her heels clicking on the floor. Richard watched her go. He waited until he heard her steps receding up the stairs. Then he pressed a hand to his forehead. His fingers were cold. He felt a rush of frustration. He wanted a clear answer, something that would ease his mind. Instead, he got anger and avoidance. He finished the meal in silence, though he barely tasted it. The servant came in to clear the plates. Richard waved him away and carried his glass of water himself. He walked through the quiet hall, passing portraits and polished furniture. He entered the library, a large room he rarely used. The shelves were lined with books he had never opened. The air smelled like paper and furniture polish. There was a thick carpet and a large desk near the window. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He could feel a dull ache behind his eyes. He tried to think logically. If Elizabeth was innocent, why didn't she calmly deny it and reassure him? Why did she get so upset? He thought about Grace again. Her words had been simple and direct. She had offered no motive other than concern. He tapped his foot against the carpet. He had no proof yet. He knew he needed more than suspicious behavior. He needed something undeniable. The idea of spying on Elizabeth felt unpleasant, but he saw no other way. He considered setting up cameras. He had the resources. He could place them discreetly and watch the footage. If Elizabeth was meeting someone secretly, this would confirm it. He stood up and moved to the window. Outside, it was dark. He saw no one. The garden lights created soft pools of light on the grass. He thought of his father and how easily trust could be broken. He had learned that early on, and now he was facing it again. He did not want to live with uncertainty. He would find the truth, one way or another. Richard decided to act soon. He would do it discreetly. He would not tell anyone. He would not confront Elizabeth again without solid proof. He would gather evidence, and then he would act. He pressed his lips together, feeling a hard tension in his jaw. He turned from the window and pulled out his phone. He would arrange for some small cameras. He would have them in place by morning. He left the library and headed to the bedroom. The house was silent. He passed the door to Elizabeth's room and saw that it was closed. He considered knocking, but decided against it. Let her think he was done with this. Let her believe he would drop it. He would not. He would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost him. In his own room, he loosened his tie and sat on the edge of the bed. He stared at the floor, his mind already planning. He did not know if Elizabeth was truly unfaithful, but he could not ignore the signs. He would watch her closely. He would catch her if she slipped. And if Grace was wrong, then at least he would know. He got up and changed into more comfortable clothes. He set his phone on the nightstand and lay down, staring up at the ceiling. He felt heavy and tired, but sleep would not come easily. He turned off the light and listened to the quiet house. He thought he heard a soft step in the hallway, probably just the staff finishing their duties. He knew he should rest, but his mind kept spinning through possibilities. Eventually, he closed his eyes and tried to relax. He planned to start early the next day. He would arrange everything. He wanted to see how Elizabeth behaved when she thought he was not paying attention. He would leave no room for doubt. He would find the truth. and then he would decide what to do. Richard woke early the next morning. He wore a simple shirt and trousers. He moved quietly through the hallways. He wanted to avoid drawing attention. He carried 2 small cameras in his jacket pocket. He had a few more tucked away in a locked drawer in his study. He would place them in spots where Elizabeth would not think to look. He thought about the library, the upstairs lounge, and the hallway outside the master bedroom. He approached the first location, a small shelf near a painting that faced the main staircase. He pressed the lens against the wood, attaching it with a hidden adhesive. He checked his phone to make sure the angle worked. The feed showed a wide view of the hallway. He nodded to himself, satisfied. He moved on to the next spot, near a light fixture in the lounge. He climbed on a chair, careful not to make noise. He placed the camera and tested it. The feed was clear. He lowered himself down and straightened his shirt. There was a soft hum from the air conditioning. He listened for footsteps. The house was still mostly quiet. A distant vacuum cleaner sound indicated a servant cleaning the dining room. He relaxed a bit and headed downstairs. In the kitchen area, he could see the garden through a glass door. Grace was outside, kneeling by a row of flowers. She wore the same overalls, the knees stained with soil. She moved slowly, pushing the trowel into the dirt, focusing on her task. She did not look up. She did not know about the cameras. No one did. Richard leaned against the frame of the door, watching her. He still wondered about her motives. She had told him about Elizabeth, but why? He considered the possibility that Grace might have lied. He did not know her well. He walked away from the kitchen and into the study. Just as he entered, he heard a knock at the front door. He closed the study door and listened. A servant's voice greeted someone. Then he heard James Hudson's voice. Richard's shoulders stiffened. He did not expect James today. He took a deep breath and stepped into the foyer. "James," Richard said, trying to sound calm, "I didn't think you'd stop by." James wore a dark suit, his shoes polished, his hair neatly combed back. He carried a leather briefcase. He smiled. "I was in the area and decided to pay a quick visit. Is that all right?" Richard shrugged. "Of course." He led James into a small sitting room off the hall. The furniture was formal, stiff chairs and a low table. He sat down and waved James to a seat opposite him. A servant brought coffee. James took a sip. "How are things, Richard? You seem tense." Richard ran a hand along the arm of the chair. "Just busy. The anniversary event is tomorrow." James nodded, crossing one leg over the other. "Yes, I remember. Many people are expecting a fine evening." "I also heard something odd." He glanced at Richard. "I heard Grace has been talking to you. She has a habit of inventing stories." Richard froze for a second. "What kind of stories?" James shrugged, setting his cup down. "I've seen her whispering nonsense to the staff. She's new here, correct? I wouldn't trust her too easily." Richard narrowed his eyes. "You think she's lying?" James sighed. "I'm saying be careful. Some workers think stirring up trouble might earn them a reward. Maybe she wants a raise or some special favor from you. I wouldn't put it past her." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What exactly have you heard?" James kept his gaze steady. "Just that she likes to spread rumors. She told the maid something about Elizabeth meeting someone. The maid told me. I find it suspicious. You know Elizabeth, right? You trust her?" Richard's chest felt tight. He remembered Grace's serious tone. He remembered Elizabeth's defensive posture. Now James was trying to discredit Grace. It made him uneasy. He took a breath. "I see," he said. "I will keep that in mind." James nodded. "Good. I don't want you to worry about nonsense on the eve of your celebration." He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "I should go. I know you're busy. I'll see you tomorrow evening." Richard followed him to the door. Elizabeth passed through the hall at that moment. She wore a fitted dress and carried a thin file of papers. She glanced at both men, gave a quick nod, and kept walking, her heels tapping on the floor. She did not say hello. She did not ask who had come to visit. She seemed distant and uninterested. James watched her go, then turned back to Richard. "See? She looks as calm as ever. Don't let anyone fill your head with nonsense." He gave a short laugh and stepped outside. The door closed behind him. Richard felt a headache forming. Now he had conflicting stories. Grace claimed Elizabeth was unfaithful. James implied Grace was a liar. Elizabeth acted indifferent, not helping clear any doubts. Richard took a slow breath and returned to the study. He checked his phone. The camera feeds were working. He saw footage of the hall and lounge. He would add more cameras if needed. He was not sure who to trust. He decided to rely only on concrete evidence. He spent the rest of the morning adjusting the surveillance. He placed another camera behind a decorative vase in the upstairs corridor. He hid one in a corner of the guest room, just in case. He made sure the feeds connected to his phone and a secure laptop in his desk drawer. He moved quietly and quickly. By late afternoon, he had done all he could. He felt hungry and ate a small sandwich in the kitchen. Outside, Grace still tended to the garden, trimming leaves and watering plants. She had not approached him again. He appreciated her silence. He had enough noise in his head as it was. In the early evening, Richard walked out to the garden with a cigar. He stood near a line of hedges, far enough that Grace could not overhear. He lit the cigar and inhaled the smoke, feeling the rough edge of tobacco on his tongue. He looked up at the darkening sky. It would be night soon, and tomorrow the anniversary event would bring guests, noise, and more pressure. He wondered if he would find the proof he needed before then. He wondered if Elizabeth would slip. He had a strong feeling that something was wrong. He did not know if he should confront her directly now or wait for the cameras to catch something undeniable. He decided to wait. He had come this far. He would not act without evidence. He would watch and gather information until he could not deny the truth. He stood there, breathing slowly, listening to the distant hum of cars outside the estate walls. The house behind him was large and quiet. He imagined Elizabeth inside, reading or checking her phone, or planning something with someone else. He felt tension in his shoulders. He wanted answers. He would get them soon, one way or another. He flicked ash onto the grass and took another drag. The smoke burned his throat slightly. The light outside was fading. The sounds of evening settled over the garden. He took a few more puffs, then dropped the cigar and crushed it under his shoe. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked back inside. Tomorrow was another day. The cameras were in place. He would wait, watch, and decide what to do. He entered the house and closed the door softly behind him. Richard sat alone in the study. Late at night. He had locked the door. The room felt quiet. He opened his laptop and checked the camera feeds. The images were clear but showed nothing unusual. He saw empty hallways, silent rooms, and still furniture. He switched between angles, hoping to catch a glimpse of Elizabeth doing something suspicious. Hours passed without any sign of misconduct. He rubbed his eyes and let out a frustrated sigh. A servant knocked on the door. "Mr. Richard, do you need anything?" The voice was muffled through the wood. He closed the laptop quickly. "No, I'm fine," he said. "Go to bed. I won't need anything else tonight." He waited until the servant's footsteps faded, then opened the laptop again. He scanned through recorded footage from earlier in the evening, checking if Elizabeth had visited any unusual part of the house. He saw her pass through the main hall, enter the lounge, and sit with a magazine for about 20 minutes. She said nothing, did nothing suspicious. Eventually, she returned to her room. Richard sighed again. He looked at the time. It was late. He felt tired. He closed the laptop and stepped out into the corridor. He kept quiet as he moved through the house. The air smelled of fresh polish. He passed by a window and saw the dark outline of the garden below. No one was outside now. Grace had gone to her quarters. The staff slept. He paused near Elizabeth's door. It was closed. He did not hear any voices inside. He placed his ear gently against the wood. Nothing. He stepped back. He didn't want to seem desperate. He needed a better plan. He had cameras, but maybe Elizabeth was too cautious. He recalled his earlier idea: simulate a short business trip and watch from a distance. That might coax her lover out into the open. Yes, that could work. Richard walked downstairs and headed to his own room. He kicked off his shoes and pulled off his shirt, then lay on the bed. He decided tomorrow he would tell Elizabeth he had to leave for a few hours, maybe half a day. He would park nearby and monitor the cameras from his car. If she was meeting someone, that would be the perfect chance. He closed his eyes and forced himself to rest. Morning arrived with weak sunlight drifting through the windows. Richard woke up early, put on a crisp white shirt and a pair of dark slacks, and headed to the dining room. He found Elizabeth sipping tea. She wore a light blouse and a neutral skirt. She looked composed. He noticed she barely acknowledged his presence. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "I have to leave this afternoon," he said, stirring the coffee. "A quick business matter came up. I won't be gone long." Elizabeth lifted her eyes. She showed mild surprise. "Today? With the anniversary tomorrow? I thought you'd be here preparing." She tapped a fingernail on the table. "Are you sure it's necessary?" "Yes," Richard said. "It won't take long. I should be back before nightfall." He took a sip of coffee. "Just a minor issue at one of the offices downtown. It can't wait." She said nothing more. She set her cup down and rose from the table. "As you wish," she said simply, and left the room. Richard watched her go. There was no warmth in her tone. She seemed indifferent, not concerned or suspicious. He wondered if this was good or bad. He finished his coffee and stood up. He wanted to ensure the cameras were properly positioned. He walked through the hall, checking the angle of a camera hidden behind a small sculpture. He straightened a nearby vase slightly, making sure it didn't block the lens. As he walked into the foyer, he saw Grace entering through the side door. She carried a few gardening tools and a small tray of seedlings. She nodded at him but said nothing. He considered asking her for more details about what she had seen, but he hesitated. If James was right, maybe Grace was a liar. He decided to keep his distance for now. He went to the study and opened his laptop, running a quick test on the camera feeds. Everything worked. He would watch the feeds from his phone while parked outside. He felt a nervous tension building in his stomach. He needed to know the truth, and this might be his best chance. By midday, he told Elizabeth he was leaving. She was in the lounge, flipping through some documents. She waved him off without much interest. He grabbed his keys, stepped outside, and walked toward his car. The driveway was quiet. The sky was overcast. He drove down the road and parked near a low stone wall that encircled the property. From here, he could access the feeds on his phone. He settled into the driver's seat and opened the camera app. He saw the main hall, empty, the lounge, empty, the upstairs corridors, empty. He waited. Minutes passed slowly. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. He turned off the engine to avoid noise. The air felt stuffy inside the car, so he lowered the window a bit. He kept one eye on the phone screen. An hour went by. He watched Elizabeth appear in the main hall. She paced there, checking her phone. She looked at the front door, then went upstairs. He followed her on the camera feed as she moved from room to room. She seemed restless. Another half-hour passed. Then he saw it. A figure approaching the side entrance on the outside camera. He zoomed in. It looked like a man, tall, wearing a dark coat. The man tried the door. It opened. He stepped inside. Richard gripped the wheel, his heartbeat pounding. He switched feeds rapidly, following the man as he crept along the corridor. He saw Elizabeth come down the stairs. She met the man at the foot of the steps. There was a brief exchange he could not hear. They moved together into the master bedroom. The door closed behind them. Richard's hand shook as he held the phone. He had the proof. It was clear. Another man had entered his home. Elizabeth had welcomed him inside. The sick feeling in his stomach returned. He felt trapped in the car, breathing shallow and fast. He watched the door. Several minutes passed. Then the door opened again. He saw them embrace. Elizabeth placed a hand on the man's arm, and they moved toward the bedroom's window. They were deep inside, out of direct camera view. He turned off the feed for a moment, pressing his head against the seat. He wanted to rush inside and confront them both, but he forced himself to wait. He needed a steady approach. He waited another 20 minutes. The man eventually slipped out the side entrance and disappeared along the garden path. Elizabeth did not follow him outside. She remained inside, unseen by the cameras for a while, then emerged looking composed. She checked her hair in a mirror and walked calmly to the lounge, as if nothing had happened. Richard swallowed hard. He had his confirmation. Elizabeth was cheating on him. He felt anger, disappointment, and confusion. He gripped the phone tightly, staring at the now empty corridors. He considered his next steps. He knew the party was tomorrow. Guests would gather, expecting a harmonious event. He had to decide how to handle this. He could expose Elizabeth, cause a scandal, or stay silent and plan a private divorce. The thought of confrontation made his hands sweat. He turned on the engine and drove away, circling the block once, then returning to the driveway. He parked and entered the house quietly. He did not announce his return. He did not call out for Elizabeth. He walked through the hall, listening carefully. He could hear distant footsteps upstairs. He passed through the dining room and into the library, locking the door behind him. In the library, he opened his laptop again and copied the recorded footage onto a secure drive. He had proof now. He would not be gaslighted or confused. He had the truth in digital form. He closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, staring at the shelves of unread books. He felt empty, but at least now he knew. Outside the locked door, the house remained quiet. He would need to confront Elizabeth. He would show her the evidence. He would watch her reaction. He wanted to see if she would lie again, or finally admit it. He needed to do it calmly. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling tense muscles. Tomorrow was the anniversary event. He had less than a day to make a decision. He stood up, straightened his shirt, and walked out of the library. He headed upstairs. He knew Elizabeth must be there. He would wait until nightfall, then confront her. He climbed the stairs step by step, each footfall heavy. He reached the landing and paused, looking down at the empty hall below. He had all the answers he needed now. There was no room for doubt. Richard stood in the upstairs hallway for a few moments before moving toward the master bedroom. The house was quiet. He opened the door without knocking. Elizabeth was inside, standing by a dresser and adjusting a small vase of flowers. She turned her head and blinked. She looked surprised to see him. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "I came back earlier than expected," he said. His voice was calm. He kept his face neutral. Inside, he felt tension in his chest. Elizabeth lifted her chin. "You said you'd be gone most of the afternoon. Is something wrong?" Richard crossed his arms. "Yes, something is wrong. I saw a man come here while I was away. I watched him enter through the side entrance. I know you met with him." His words were blunt. He noticed her flinch. She pressed her lips together. "You're mistaken," she said. Her tone sounded defensive. "Maybe a salesman came by. I haven't spoken to anyone except the staff." Richard's nostrils flared slightly. "I have proof. I recorded everything." He tapped his phone in his pocket. "This is not just gossip from the gardener. I know what you're doing." Elizabeth's forehead tightened. She tried to maintain composure, but he saw the worry in her eyes. She took a step back, bumping the dresser. The vase rattled. "Richard, you're making no sense. Why would I have another man in the house? We have an event tomorrow. I've been busy." He stepped forward. "Stop lying. I saw you with him. You were in our bedroom. I watched him leave afterward." He spoke in a low voice, teeth clenched. "I've had suspicions for a while. Now I have confirmation. Don't treat me like a fool." She gripped the edge of the dresser. "You've been spying on me." Her voice rose slightly. "That's invasive. You're the one causing problems, sneaking around, putting cameras in our home. How dare you?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "Don't turn this around. I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't driven to find the truth. You gave me reasons to doubt you. You never show any real warmth. You avoid direct answers. Now I see why." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. She glanced at the door, as if considering running out, but he stood in front of it. She shook her head. "All right, fine. Let's say I had a visitor. So what? Does it matter now? We both know our marriage is not what it used to be." He swallowed hard. Hearing her say it so directly felt like a blow. "You could have asked for a separation instead of humiliating me." He pointed a finger at her. "This is my house, and you brought him here. That's a step too far." She rolled her shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. "Don't act shocked. Our relationship has been empty for a long time. We barely speak. You're always locked away in your study, or out handling business deals. What did you expect?" Richard let out a short breath. "I expected loyalty. If we had problems, we could talk. We could end it gracefully. But you went behind my back." He raised his hand, then dropped it, as if pushing the thought away. "This is done. I won't play this game." Elizabeth crossed her arms. "What do you want from me now? An apology? Tears? It won't change anything. You have your money, your status. What difference does it make if I found comfort elsewhere? He clenched his jaw. He wanted to shout, but he forced himself to stay quiet. It makes a difference to me. He spoke slowly. I don't care about the fortune right now. I cared about honesty. Now that's gone. She lowered her gaze. For a moment, she looked uncertain. So, what are you going to do? Create a scandal at the anniversary event? Tell everyone I cheated? Ruin the facade we built? Richard tilted his head. I don't know yet. I don't want a spectacle. I'm not interested in making a scene, but I also won't pretend everything is fine. He took a step back, giving her some space. I'm going to end this marriage. I'll talk to my lawyer. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes narrowing. A divorce? That will draw attention. People will talk. Are you sure you want that? He nodded. I'm sure. I don't want to live like this. Our life together is a lie. He gripped the doorknob behind him. I can arrange it quietly. I don't need to drag our names through the mud. I just want out. She shrugged, though her face showed tension. Fine, if that's what you want. Just don't expect me to shed any tears. We've both known this was coming. He didn't answer. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving her alone. He walked down the corridor, his steps slow and heavy. He felt a mix of anger, relief, and sadness. He passed by a window and saw the garden below. Grace was out there, weeding the flower beds. He paused for a moment, watching her steady movements. She looked peaceful, unaware of the conflict inside the house. Richard continued down the stairs, passing a servant who bowed slightly. He ignored the gesture and headed for the kitchen. He needed water. He poured himself a glass at the sink and took a long drink. The water tasted clean and cold. He set the glass down and rubbed his eyes. He kept thinking about what he had just done. He had confronted Elizabeth, and she had not even tried to deny it in the end. She had turned it around, blaming him for being distant. Maybe he had been distant, but that did not excuse her betrayal. He breathed out slowly. Now he had to decide how to handle this going forward. He wanted a quiet divorce. He wanted to avoid a scandal. The guests arriving tomorrow would suspect nothing if he kept his cool. He could host the event, smile politely, then handle the legal details afterward. Or he could cancel the event, but that might raise questions. He did not want to explain himself to anyone. He looked out the window again. Grace had moved on to another section of the garden. He admired her patience, her quiet diligence. She had told him the truth when no one else would. Now he understood her intentions better. She hadn't tried to gain anything. She had given him information he needed, without pushing for a reward. He decided he would speak to Grace soon. He would not accuse her of lying, and he would not ignore her either. He appreciated her honesty now. He wanted to clear the air. He left the kitchen and walked out to the garden. The sun was warm on his face. He approached Grace, who looked up, noticing his presence. He spoke in a soft tone, careful to keep his voice steady. You told me the truth about Elizabeth. I didn't want to believe it at first, but you were right. Grace nodded, rising to her feet. She kept her hands at her sides, the fingertips dirty from the soil. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Richard shook his head. Don't be. You did the right thing. I just wanted to say, thank you. You didn't have to tell me, but you did. He cleared his throat. I respect that. Grace frowned slightly, looking at him with calm eyes. I didn't like seeing you lied to, she said simply. He felt a tightness in his chest. different from before. It wasn't anger or betrayal, it was a kind of relief. "I appreciate it," he said. He looked around at the garden. It felt more real than anything inside the house. "I won't forget your honesty." He turned to go, but then stopped. He faced her again. "I know this sounds strange, but after tomorrow's event, I'd like to talk more. Maybe have a coffee in the kitchen. Something simple." Grace nodded. "Sure," she said. "Whatever you say." Richard half smiled and walked back toward the house. He had a plan now. He would finalize the divorce quietly. No theatrics. He would take control of his life again. He would focus on what mattered, on honest connections. Maybe he didn't know what the future held, but he knew what he wouldn't tolerate anymore. He reached the door and stepped inside. The air felt cooler. He climbed the stairs again, this time not stopping at the master bedroom door. He went straight to his room and closed the door behind him. He needed to prepare himself for tomorrow. He needed to keep his composure. Soon, this would all be behind him. Richard woke before sunrise. He dressed in a plain shirt and trousers, wanting to feel comfortable. He planned to oversee the final details for the evening's event, then handle whatever documents he could to start the divorce process. He had no interest in dragging this out. He wanted it done quietly. He would not tell Elizabeth yet. He would let her keep her calm facade. He went downstairs and checked the foyer. 2 staff members were polishing the floor and dusting the furniture. They greeted him politely. He nodded in return. He looked around, ensuring that everything would be ready for the guests. The party was scheduled for the evening. It would be a small gathering, just a handful of business associates and old acquaintances. He walked into the dining room, where another servant arranged table settings. The silverware gleamed under the lights. He noted there were enough glasses, plates, and napkins. Everything seemed in order. He said, "Good work. Keep it simple. No need for extravagant decorations." The servant nodded and continued placing forks in neat alignment. Next, he visited the kitchen. 2 cooks were preparing sauces and chopping vegetables. The smell of fresh herbs filled the room. He leaned against the counter. "Tonight's menu is straightforward," he asked one of the cooks. "Yes, sir," the cook said. "Light appetizers, a main dish of roasted meat and grilled vegetables, and a simple dessert. Nothing heavy." "Perfect," Richard said. He left the kitchen and headed outside. The sky was brightening. Grace was already outside, watering some flowers near the back fence. She turned when she heard him approach. "Good morning," Richard said quietly. "I just wanted to check in. The event is tonight. I'll make sure we keep it short. After that, we can talk, like I mentioned." Grace nodded, her expression calm. "I'll finish trimming the hedges and then stay out of the way," she said. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Everything looks good outside." "Thank you," Richard said. He stayed for a moment, watching her work. There was no rush in her movements. He appreciated her steady manner. Then he returned to the house. He would finalize his plan. He headed to the study and called his lawyer. The call was short and direct. He did not reveal details, just that he wanted to discuss divorce proceedings soon. The lawyer understood and agreed to meet the next day. Richard hung up and leaned back in his chair, exhaling. He would not drag this out. He had the evidence. He had no reason to endure a sham marriage any longer. A light knock on the door startled him. "Enter," he said, adjusting his posture. Elizabeth stepped in. She wore a formal dress, hair neatly done. She looked at him with a calm face, as if last night's confrontation never happened. "I assume you still want to hold the event?" she asked. Her tone was businesslike. "Yes," he said. "I see no reason to cancel. People are expecting it." Elizabeth nodded. "Fine. I will greet the guests. Let's keep it civilized." She paused, folding her hands. "I trust you won't cause a scene tonight." Richard met her eyes. "I won't embarrass us. I'll treat everyone politely. I suggest you do the same." She tilted her head slightly. "Of course." Without another word, she left. He watched her go, relieved that she was not fighting him on this. He had no interest in further arguments. He would get through tonight, then start the process to end this marriage. The day passed slowly. The staff prepared the house. Elizabeth kept to herself. Richard stayed in the study, checking emails, making phone calls, reviewing old documents. He wanted to distract himself. Around mid-afternoon, he went back to the garden. He saw Grace working on a low hedge near the main walkway. He stood a short distance away, not wanting to interrupt her task. When she looked up, he approached. "Grace, after tomorrow, I'll have some changes here. I'm going to move forward with the divorce. Just keep that to yourself." She nodded, not appearing surprised. "Understood." He shifted on his feet. "Your honesty helped me. I was upset at first, but I'm glad I know the truth now." Grace tapped the hedge with her shears, removing a small branch. "I'm not good at lying," she said simply. "I wanted you to know, that's all." Richard swallowed. "I appreciate it." He turned away, walking back inside before anyone noticed them talking too long. He knew how rumors spread. As evening approached, he changed into a suit. He chose a dark one, with a crisp white shirt and a simple tie. He checked himself in the mirror. He looked composed. He knew guests would arrive soon. The house was quiet now, as if holding its breath before the event. The first guest arrived, a business associate named Harold. He shook Richard's hand firmly, smiling. "Congratulations on another year," Harold said. Richard nodded and forced a polite smile. Elizabeth stepped forward, greeting Harold with a light touch on his arm. She played her role well, showing no sign of tension. More guests arrived, a couple from a nearby estate, 2 old colleagues of Richard's, and finally, James Hudson. James approached Richard, smiling too widely. "How are you, my friend? Everything looks wonderful." Richard stiffened at the sight of James. He remembered James warning him against Grace. Now he knew the truth. Still, Richard stayed calm. "I'm well, James. Please, help yourself to a drink. Enjoy the evening." The group gathered in the lounge. They sipped drinks, made small talk, and joked about old times. Elizabeth glided through the room, polite and distant. Richard answered questions about business projects and nodded politely. He felt detached, going through the motions. At dinner, the guests praised the food. They discussed current market trends, travel plans, and other harmless topics. Richard responded when necessary, but mostly he listened. His mind drifted to the future. He wanted this over with. He considered the documents he would sign soon. He imagined a simpler life without constant suspicion. From a window in the dining room, he glimpsed a corner of the garden. He wondered if Grace was still out there somewhere. Probably not. It was late. She likely finished her work and went to her quarters. He focused back on the table. Elizabeth smiled at a guest's anecdote. James laughed too loudly at a joke. Richard forced a small grin at the right moment. When dinner ended, the guests moved back to the lounge. They talked about wines and joked about old memories. Richard kept his responses brief. Elizabeth seemed content to let him remain quiet. Eventually, one by one, the guests prepared to leave. Richard thanked them for coming, shook hands, and accepted polite farewells. James lingered a bit. He tried to pull Richard aside. "Listen, about Grace," he said, lowering his voice. "I hope you didn't take her words too seriously. I still think she causes trouble." Richard gave James a flat look. "I have my own conclusions now. Don't worry about it." He spoke firmly. "Thank you for coming, James. Have a good night." James looked uncertain, but nodded and left. When everyone was gone, the house felt quieter than ever. Elizabeth stood by the empty lounge. She folded her arms. "That went smoothly," she said. "No drama." Richard loosened his tie. "Yes, no drama." He did not add anything more. He turned and climbed the stairs. Elizabeth did not follow him. In his room, he removed his suit jacket and placed it on a chair. He took off his tie and unbuttoned his shirt collar. He looked at himself in the mirror. He felt tired but calm. The event was done. The marriage would soon end. He glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was late, but he had no reason to rush anything tonight. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He thought about tomorrow. He would call his lawyer again and get the process started. He would tell Elizabeth they were done, calmly and plainly. She would not fight it. She had already admitted their marriage was hollow. He heard light footsteps in the hallway, probably a servant cleaning up after the guests. He ignored them. He would have a quiet divorce, a clean break. No headlines, no big announcements. After that, he could decide how to live differently. Maybe he would spend more time in the garden, talk to Grace over coffee like he promised. He did not need to plan too far ahead right now. He stood up, pulled off his shirt, and changed into more comfortable clothes. He turned off the light and lay down, staring at the dark ceiling. The night was quiet. He could almost hear his own heartbeat. He closed his eyes, ready to let this night end and move forward. Richard woke early the next morning. He dressed in casual clothes, a simple shirt and trousers. The night had passed without interruptions. He stepped into the hallway and moved quietly downstairs. The house felt calm. The event was over. There were no guests now, just a sense of calm emptiness. He made his way to the study and closed the door. He called his lawyer first thing. The line rang twice. The lawyer's voice sounded alert, though it was early. Richard spoke in a direct tone. "I've decided to divorce Elizabeth," he said. "I have proof of her infidelity. I want it done quietly. No public mess." The lawyer asked a few short questions and made practical suggestions. Richard took a few notes on a pad. He confirmed he wanted to keep it simple. A fair settlement, no public battles, no drawn-out negotiations. The lawyer agreed to start preparing documents. Richard hung up, feeling a slight tension in his chest loosen. He had taken the first step. No turning back now. He left the study and headed toward the kitchen. The servants were starting their morning routines. He saw one dusting a side table in the hall, another carrying fresh linens upstairs. Everyone moved quietly. He liked this silence. He had spent too long surrounded by forced chatter and empty conversations. In the kitchen, he poured himself a cup of coffee. He sipped it while leaning against the counter. He would tell Elizabeth soon. Maybe not right this second, but today. He wanted this settled. He would just say it plainly. They would end the marriage. No accusations, no arguments, just done. He took another sip of coffee. It tasted strong and bitter. He felt awake, more so than in recent weeks. He finished the coffee and set the mug down. He walked to the door leading outside. The early sun cast light over the garden. He stepped out, letting the cool morning air hit his face. He strolled along a stone path, noticing how neat the hedges looked. Grace had done her usual good work. He spotted her near the far corner, pulling a few weeds. She wore her overalls and boots, her back to him. He approached slowly. When he was a few steps behind her, she turned, sensing his presence. She pushed some strands of hair back from her forehead and stood up straight, looking at him. He cleared his throat. "I spoke with my lawyer this morning," he said. "I'm going through with the divorce." Grace nodded, no sign of surprise on her face. "I see," she said. Her tone was neutral. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm relieved," he said. "I know this was never your problem, but your honesty helped me reach this point. I was trapped in doubts. Now, I'm free to make a clean break." Grace bent down to pick up a small pile of trimmed leaves and placed them in a bucket. "I'm glad you did what you needed to do," she said simply. Richard looked at her hands, rough from work, steady and sure. "I know we don't know each other well," he said, "but I meant it when I said I'd like to have a coffee with you. Maybe after things settle. Today, even. Just a quiet talk. Nothing special." She studied him for a moment. "I don't see why not," she said. "Just let me finish here." He nodded and turned back toward the house. He felt a slight flutter in his stomach. He reminded himself to keep things simple. He was not looking for anything complicated, just a real conversation with someone who had not lied to him. Inside, he passed through the halls, checking if Elizabeth was awake. He did not see her yet. He considered whether to speak to her before or after talking to Grace. He decided to wait. He wanted to feel calm and steady first. He looked out a window and saw Grace carrying the bucket toward the tool shed. She worked efficiently, not wasting moves. He went to the kitchen and rinsed his coffee mug. He leaned against the sink, staring out the window. He thought about all the money he had, the huge house, the cars, the business dealings. None of that had protected him from betrayal. It had only shielded him from reality for a while. Now he wanted reality, even if it was plain and quiet. He preferred a direct truth over a polished lie. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Elizabeth appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wore a house robe, her hair tied back. She looked at him, expression blank. "You're up early," she said. Her tone lacked warmth. He turned to face her. "I spoke to my lawyer," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm ending this marriage. We can arrange it quietly. No scandal. Just a simple divorce." Elizabeth's face tightened for a moment, then relaxed. She nodded. "Fine," she said. "I won't fight it. Let's end it quietly." She looked away, glancing at the window. "I never intended to drag this out." Richard studied her face. She seemed resigned. He felt no anger now, just relief. "Good," he said. "We'll speak more about details later. For now, I suggest we keep it polite until the paperwork is sorted." She sighed and walked away without another word. He did not follow her. He felt light, as if a heavy weight had lifted from his shoulders. He picked up a second mug from the cupboard, one that was plain and sturdy. He filled it with coffee. He decided to bring it outside for Grace. When he stepped out again, Grace was closing the tool shed door. He approached, holding the mug carefully. "Here," he said, extending it to her. "Coffee. If you have time, we can sit somewhere." She took the mug, taking care not to spill. "Thanks," she said. "Let's sit by the small patio." She nodded toward a corner of the garden where a simple wooden bench stood under a tree. He followed her there, feeling a slight tension in his stomach. He was not sure what he wanted to say. He just knew he wanted to share a moment of honesty. They sat down. The bench felt firm, the wood a bit rough. He rested his hands on his knees, while she sipped the coffee and held the mug in both hands. Birds chirped in the distance. The air smelled like damp earth and leaves. He cleared his throat. "I know this might seem odd, me wanting to talk like this," he said. "I've spent too much time surrounded by people who only wanted something from me. Now I'm just looking for a normal conversation with someone who's not playing games." Grace nodded slowly. "I get it," she said. "I don't have much to say about fancy parties or business deals, but I can listen." Her voice was steady. Richard took a breath. "That's all I need. I've been through a lot of stress, wondering who to trust. You were straightforward with me. I respect that. You gave me a truth I needed, even though it might have caused trouble for you." Grace shrugged. "I don't like secrets. This place is beautiful, but it can feel heavy. People pretend a lot. I saw you standing in the garden that day, and you looked unsure. I thought you deserved to know." He appreciated her honesty. He liked that she didn't dress it up with flattery or excuses. "Thank you," he said. "Now that I'm moving on, I'm thinking I need to simplify my life. Less false friends, less formal dinners, less pretending, more real moments." Grace sipped her coffee. "That sounds like a good plan," she said. She watched a small bird land on a branch. "You're the one who decides how you live." Richard nodded. He realized he was smiling slightly. He felt steady here, sitting on a bench with a woman who worked in his garden, sharing a coffee. No ceremony, no pressure. They talked a bit about the garden, the weather, small things. He asked her about the type of flowers she planted. She told him their names, what each one needed to thrive. He listened, interested. He liked the way she spoke plainly. He liked that she did not try to impress him. Eventually, they fell into a comfortable silence. He looked at the house from this angle. It was large, quiet, and suddenly less intimidating. He could see himself spending more time here, not locked in a study, but out in the garden, or in the kitchen, or reading a book he actually cared about. He wanted to shake off old habits and try something different. Grace finished her coffee and set the mug on the bench. "I should get back to work," she said, standing up. "Still a lot to do?" Richard stood as well. "Thanks for taking the time," he said. "I needed this." She gave a short nod and walked off, heading toward a patch of shrubs that needed pruning. He watched her go, then picked up the empty mug and carried it back inside. He felt calmer, more certain of what he wanted. He would finalize the divorce, stop entertaining empty relationships, and learn to be more present. He placed the mug on the kitchen counter and leaned back against the sink. He felt ready for the next steps. He looked outside again, thinking he might spend more afternoons out there. He no longer feared his future. He would face it directly. Richard began his morning by making a brief call to his lawyer. The lawyer confirmed that the paperwork would be ready soon. Richard listened without showing emotion. He wanted the process to move forward quietly. He thanked the lawyer and hung up. He felt calm. There was no need to rush. They would finalize details in the next few days. After the call, he walked through the house. He noticed how quiet it felt. No forced laughter. No stiff conversations. He saw a servant cleaning the lounge. He nodded a greeting and continued on. He decided to skip any unnecessary business meetings this week. He would cancel them later. He did not want to spend time on empty deals or superficial lunches. He wanted space. He passed the dining room and ended up in the kitchen. It smelled like fresh coffee and bread. A cook was mixing dough in a large bowl. The hum of the refrigerator was steady. He opened a cabinet and took down 2 coffee mugs. He filled both with hot coffee. He added no sugar or cream, just plain coffee. He liked the simple taste now. It reminded him of his talk with Grace the day before. He carried the mugs out to the garden. It was early, and the sun was rising. He saw Grace near a group of shrubs, checking leaves for pests. She wore the same overalls, her hair pulled back neatly. He approached slowly. "Morning," he said, holding out 1 mug. "Thought you might want a coffee." Grace glanced at him and took the mug. She sipped carefully. "Thanks," she said. "I appreciate it." He nodded. "I decided to reduce some business meetings. I have no reason to run around so much. I want to focus on settling things here first." Grace shrugged. "Whatever makes sense for you." They walked together to a small bench near the side of the garden. The wood felt cool. He sat down, holding his mug. She stood beside him, leaning against a short fence. He looked at the sky. He could hear birds. He could smell the soil and grass. It felt peaceful. "I don't know why I waited so long to notice these things," he said. "I always rushed through life, focused on deals, parties, appearances. Now that it's quiet, I see what I missed." Grace took another sip of coffee. "Sometimes it takes a change," she said. "You had a routine. Now you broke it." He agreed silently. He remembered how he would spend hours in his study, ignoring the garden and the people working outside. Now he saw the value in honest conversations and simple routines. He took a slow sip of coffee. "I'll let you get back to work," he said, standing up. "Thanks for listening again." Grace nodded. "Sure," she said. "I'll be around." He walked back into the house. Inside, he moved through a series of rooms he rarely visited before. He entered a small sitting room with 2 armchairs and a low table. He sat in one of the chairs and rested his coffee mug on his knee. He looked at the walls, the floor, the furniture. He thought about how all of it used to impress guests. Now it just felt like things he owned. Nothing more. He wanted to make the house feel less like a museum and more like a home. He decided to open some windows. He walked to the lounge and slid 2 windows up, letting in fresh air. He asked a servant to open curtains in the hallway. He wanted natural light, not just artificial lamps. The servant nodded and carried out his instructions. The corridor brightened, showing dust motes in the air. Richard did not mind. He preferred seeing things as they were. Later, he entered the library. He had always seen it as a trophy room lined with books he never read. He approached a shelf and ran a finger along the spines. He picked a thin paperback from the middle of a row. He flipped through the pages. It was a simple novel. He thought maybe he could read it, just to pass the time and learn something new. He took the book and sat at the large desk. He read a few paragraphs. The style was plain and clear. The characters faced simple problems. He liked that it was straightforward. No one here cared about his money. It was just a story. He turned a few more pages, then closed the book. He would read more later. At least he had found something to do besides brood. Around midday, Elizabeth appeared in the hallway. She saw him standing by the open windows. She raised an eyebrow. "You're redecorating?" she asked, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. He shrugged. "I'm letting light in. This place was always too closed off." He looked at her calmly. He felt no anger now, just distance. "I won't stop you from doing what you want, but I'll be moving on." She exhaled. "Do as you please," she said. She walked away, heels clicking on the floor. He did not follow her. He went to the kitchen for a snack. A servant offered him a plate of sliced fruit. He thanked the servant and ate quietly. He tasted each piece. The sweetness was mild and pleasant. It reminded him that simple things had value. He did not need elaborate meals or imported delicacies right now. He just wanted honest work, honest food, honest company. After eating, he stepped outside again. Grace was trimming a hedge. He watched her for a moment, then joined her. He looked at the hedge. The leaves were small and neat. He considered asking if she needed help, but decided he might just get in her way. Instead, he stood nearby and observed. "Do you enjoy this work?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded. "It's straightforward. I know what needs to be done. I see results. I don't have to guess who's lying or pretending." He ran a hand over the top of the hedge. The leaves felt cool and slightly damp. "That must be nice," he said. "I'm starting to appreciate that. I might focus on simpler things now. I'm done with empty shows of importance." Grace nodded again, finishing a small section before turning to face him. "Glad to hear that." He stepped back, allowing her to continue. He realized he was relaxing here, in the garden, just being present. He did not need to impress her or buy her approval. She asked for nothing. He respected that. He felt comfortable. Inside, he made a few calls to reschedule pointless meetings. He canceled 2 lunches with people he barely knew. He politely declined a dinner invitation from James Hudson. James tried to press him, but Richard cut the call short. He had no reason to spend time with someone who only thought about his wealth. In the afternoon, he took the paperback novel and sat in the lounge, reading a few pages while the sunlight filtered in. He looked out the window now and then, seeing Grace move through the garden. He found the sound of her tools, faint through the glass, reassuring. When he got tired of reading, he set the book down and stood by the window. He watched a few birds hop along the lawn, pecking at the ground. He did not know their names, but he liked the way they moved. Everything was clear and real. No more guessing games, no more false words. He preferred this life. He knew the divorce would finalize soon. He would sign papers and separate finances. He did not worry about that now. He would handle it as it came. For once, he would face reality without flinching. He had no appetite for drama or revenge. He just wanted to be free of old burdens. As the sun lowered, he considered making tea and offering some to Grace. He could invite her inside, just to sit at the kitchen table and talk a bit more. He would not rush it. He would let things grow naturally. For now, he was content knowing he had choices he never allowed himself before. He turned from the window, took a slow breath, and headed to the kitchen. He would prepare 2 cups of tea, something milder without fancy ingredients. Simple and direct, like the conversations he valued now. He had plenty of time. He no longer chased illusions. Richard woke up feeling rested. He stood by his bedroom window and looked out at the early light. The paperwork for the divorce would be ready soon, and he felt no fear about it. He dressed in casual clothes again, just simple trousers and a shirt. He had no reason to wear formal suits if no one was there to impress. He walked downstairs. The servants were polishing the foyer, dusting light fixtures, and arranging fresh linens. He greeted them quietly and headed to the kitchen. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, as he had done before, and carried them outside. He found Grace kneeling near a small patch of flowers. She glanced up, noticing him. "Morning," he said, handing her a mug. "I hope it's not too early." She took the mug and sipped. "Early is fine," she said. "I like starting the day before it gets too hot." He sat on the grass beside her, not worrying about his trousers getting a bit dirty. The ground felt cool. He looked at the flowers. Their petals were small and pale. He watched Grace pick off a few dead leaves and drop them into a small bucket. He found the quiet work soothing to watch. "I spoke to my lawyer," he said after a moment. "It won't take long now, just signing papers, a few days, maybe a week." His voice stayed calm. Grace nodded. "That's good. You'll be free to do what you want." He thought about that. What did he want? He wanted to live without constant suspicion. He wanted to enjoy the garden and maybe learn more about the flowers. He wanted honest company. He looked at Grace's focused expression. She was not trying to impress him. She did her job well because it mattered to her. He respected that. "After it's final, I might travel less," he said, finishing his coffee. "Stay here more often. Make this place feel like home." He set his empty mug on the ground. Grace placed a trimmed leaf in her bucket. "That sounds like a plan," she said simply. They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. He liked that there was no pressure to fill the silence with empty words. He heard distant birds and felt a light breeze. After a while, he stood up and offered her a hand. She accepted it and stood, holding her mug. Together they walked toward a small shed where she stored tools. He didn't step inside, just waited at the doorway while she put away some gloves and a small spade. When she came out, he said, "If you have time later, maybe we can share some tea inside. Sit at the kitchen table. Nothing complicated." Grace studied him, her face calm. "Sure," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded and headed back indoors, letting her finish her tasks. Inside, he found that the day felt lighter than before. He did not think about Elizabeth or the failed marriage with anger now. He felt only relief that he would soon be done with that chapter of his life. He walked through the house, opening windows again to let in fresh air. In the library, he picked up the paperback novel he had started. He read a few more pages, enjoying the simple story. There were no grand plots, just ordinary people dealing with small problems. It suited his mood. He felt no rush to finish the book, just as he felt no rush to make grand plans. After reading for a while, he closed the book and went to the kitchen to prepare tea. He boiled water, chose a plain black tea, and placed 2 mugs on the counter. He waited, leaning against the sink, looking out the window. He saw Grace approach the house from the garden path. She wiped her hands on a rag before entering. When she stepped into the kitchen, he poured the tea. He set the mugs on a small wooden table in the corner. He pulled out a chair for her and then sat down himself. The kitchen felt quiet and warm. He smelled the tea's aroma and noticed how it blended with the faint scent of bread from earlier. They sipped their tea. They spoke about simple things: the weather, the best time to prune certain plants, whether to plant more herbs near the kitchen window. He asked her what flowers grew best in shade. She answered with short, direct replies. He liked that there was no need for flattery or hollow compliments. At one point, he said, "I've spent years not knowing who to trust. Now I feel I can trust you. You told me the truth about Elizabeth. You had nothing to gain, but you spoke up anyway." Grace shrugged lightly, looking at him. "It felt wrong to say nothing," she said. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I just thought you should know." He tapped a finger on the table's surface. "I appreciate it. Now I can move forward. I can let go of what didn't matter and hold on to what does." She sipped her tea without responding. He realized that was enough. He did not need her to say more. They sat there, sharing the quiet space, the warmth of the kitchen, and the simplicity of tea in plain mugs. Eventually, she stood, thanked him for the tea, and said she needed to get back to work. He walked her to the door, not pressing for anything more. As she stepped outside, he watched her go, her steps steady and purposeful. Richard stood at the threshold, feeling the mild air on his face. He would sign the divorce papers, rearrange his life, and find a better balance. He would spend more time here, not locked away in an office. He would talk to people honestly. He would welcome calm afternoons and small talks over coffee or tea. He had learned that honesty and directness mattered more than wealth or showy events. He closed the door gently and stepped back into the house. He picked up the empty mugs and washed them in the sink. The water ran clear. He dried the mugs and placed them in the cabinet. He looked around the kitchen, noting how normal it felt now. No tension, no secrets. He would meet with his lawyer soon and finalize the divorce. He would keep it quiet, as he had promised. He would let Elizabeth go and wish her no harm. He had no room for resentment. He had too many things to discover now. How to care for his garden, how to choose better friends, and how to enjoy moments without trying to control everything. Richard turned off the kitchen light and walked into the hall. The day stretched ahead of him, open and unforced. He had the freedom to shape it as he pleased. He would enjoy that freedom. He would keep his word to himself. No more empty facades. He headed toward the lounge, where he had left the paperback novel. Maybe he would read a few more pages, or maybe just watch the light shift across the floor. No hurry. He could hear soft sounds from outside, Grace's tools at work, and he liked knowing she was there, honest and steady. He settled into a chair, relaxed his shoulders, and let the quiet house surround him. This was how he wanted to live now, facing each day without pretense. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.